Good morning, North Harbor. It's Easter. Happy Easter. I hope that this morning finds you well amidst all the chaos that we're experiencing around the globe right now. I know that this time has been very disorienting to many people. Routines, expectations, socializing has just gotten completely disrupted and has knocked us all around a bit. One of the questions I'm asking people all the time is, how are you doing? And I was just thinking yesterday that, typically when you run into people in the store or, some other place, in church, in the lobby, coming and going from church, when you ask people how you're doing, you get this fine, good. And it just seems like a greeting that we have this rote answer for, but not anymore. In these times, when we're asking how you doing, we get real answers. We're asking real questions, and we're really listening, to how people are doing, how we can help. And so I do hope that you're doing well. The other night, I was meeting with some people online, just to checking with some friends, and we were going through this question: how are you doing right now? What do you need? What's what are the trials that you're going through? And one person answered in a way that was just remarkable. It was so refreshing to hear that I just wanted to share it with you all. That this person said, this pandemic and this social distancing and all the things that are going on have been so good for their spiritual disciplines. That they are finding themselves connecting to God more often than they were before, that they're reading scripture more often, they're listening to teachings more often, they're praying more often. And it was just so refreshing to hear that through this trial, through this crisis, they're connecting in a deeper way. And you could hear it in their voice, and it was so refreshing to hear. And it just got me thinking about how when we go through trials, whether they're big global ones like we're going through now, or just, as life used to be and typical, when life will get back, we still have trials. I think of like the single parent who is just struggling to make ends meet financially, or, just trying to make time for their kids when they've got so much to do on their own. I think of couples, they go through difficult times, or divorce even, and how those sort of things can just monopolize our attention. I think of students, just in the best of times, being a high school senior or a college senior, those times, those young adult years where we're just trying to figure out who we are and what we're going to do in life and how we're going to approach life. Just our identity is taking shape. That's a very difficult time for many people, even when things are going well, let alone when we're going through struggles. I think of people that are dealing with mental health issues, anxiety and depression, all these sorts of things that just seem to consume us when we're in the midst of that season. Anyway, the point is that when we go through difficult times, oftentimes that trial, that grief, those doubts, that shame, or whatever it is that we're going through, just seems to monopolize our energy, monopolize our attention, monopolize everything. And it can be so hard to find God. And then we feel all this shame that we're not doing what we should be doing. We're not a great disciple. We shouldn't feel this way because Jesus is risen from the dead. Jesus is alive and well. And we have a message where death has been defeated. How can we, be struggling so much? And so I want to tell you now that the good news this morning is that in the midst of our trial, in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of a global pandemic, God comes out to meet us, does not wait for us to pull it all together, to find him, doesn't wait for us to be the perfect disciple, to begin to follow. He comes to us and meets us there in the midst of our trial. Jesus isn't fussy about where we're at personally. He will go in the midst of that trial and meet us there. And we're all going through trials. We're all going through this global trial. So I pray that this is the case for you this morning, that you will find Jesus in the midst of it. I pray that you have an experience like my friend had, that this can be a time where you see God in greater ways. And And beyond the pandemic that we're living through right now, just the regular trials of life, that God will meet you there. The good news about the resurrection isn't so much that we just believe that Jesus rose from the dead, that death is defeated. Those are incredible things, life-giving things. But more personally, that Jesus will meet you where you're at. He will find you where you're at in the midst of your struggle. And so this morning, we're going to look at 3 different people who are going through trials. Much like last week, we looked at 4 different portraits of people on Good Friday. This morning, we're going to look at 3 different portraits of people on Good Friday, all who have their own struggles, and Jesus goes to meet them there. In the midst of this resurrection, it's Jesus who's going to meet them, not them who have to have it all together. So we're going to start with Mary, Mary Magdalene. And these stories are going to be found in John 20 and John 21. Our first 2 stories, our first 2 portraits are in John chapter 20. And we read in verse 11 that Mary was standing outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she stooped and looked in. Now, just to give some background, she's crying because Jesus was crucified. He died. He was a friend. He was a leader. He was what she believed would be her future king, the Messiah, her Savior. He changed her life in his ministry and his teaching. And he died. And so her trial right now is her grief, her sorrow. And we see that she comes crying. And not only that, but she's going to discover that the tomb is empty, and that's going to magnify her grief, because not only did she lose a friend, but now she is getting into this panic mode where she's wondering if she will be able to give him a proper burial. And this is a really big deal, that when you meet someone you love, you lose someone you love, you want to send them off in a way that honors and dignifies them. And she's finding, she's discovering that might not happen for her. So she's crying, she's grief. So we think of grief and loss. We've all experienced this at some point. What happens here? What happens in the midst of this grief and loss? Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped, she looked in. She saw 2 white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angel asked her. "Because they've taken my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they've put him." This is the issue. He's gone. That's the issue. Her good friend, her leader, her Savior, the person who changed her life is gone, and she's feeling this grief. And she doesn't know. We had this idea of, I don't know what's going on. Her world has become disoriented, and she's having a very difficult time. She turned to leave, saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she did not recognize him. Jesus asked her, "Dear woman, why are you crying?" She asked. So the issue that the story keeps focusing on is her grief, her crying. Why are you crying? Why are you crying? That's what John, the author John, is pointing our eyes at, her grief. Who are you looking for? She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you've taken him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will go and get him." You almost get the sense that, I don't even care why, I don't even care what, but if you're the one that's taking him away, all I want is to get to him. All I want is to be with him. Even if he's passed away, I want to be with him and give him the burial he deserves. And then Jesus says this. I love this. Verse 16, "Mary," Jesus says, just says her name. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher, right? So all he says is her name, and all of a sudden she realizes who it is. Now, it doesn't come through in the English version here, but earlier on, as we're introduced to her in verse 11, it says Mary was standing, and Mary there is Maria in Greek. It's a Greek word, Maria. And this is the term that she would have been known by. Most people call me Dan, even though my name is Daniel, right? This is the name that she would have been known by, that people call her all the time. The Roman soldiers, the disciples, perhaps Jesus. It's the friendly, it's the casual greeting. But when he says Mary in verse 16, he uses her Hebrew name, Miriam, and he calls her the name that her parents gave her. This is the name that her father gave her. This is a bit more intimate. Jesus comes to her in the midst of her grief. does not have to wait for her to pull it together. He's not gonna wait till, she gets over it. Not gonna wait till, she can really turn her attention on bigger things or on other things or on, regular life again. Isn't gonna wait. Jesus comes to her and uses her God-given name, her parent-given name, the name her father gave her, the name Miriam, her Hebrew name, her real name. And she tries to grab on to him. In the midst of her grief, she's trying to grab on. And he does something which is startling. He says, don't cling to me, for I haven't yet ascended to the Father. But go, find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father. Go to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, I've seen the Lord. Then she gave them his message. And so in the midst of her grief, she wants to hold on. That's at the heart of her struggle right there, is grabbing on to Jesus and being with him. And he says, no, not yet. And so in the midst of our grief, he comes and he gives her a commission, sends her out to do something. And, we don't have to wait till everything works itself out, till we're finally on settled ground. Jesus comes in the midst of that, in the midst of our grief and our loss and our trial. He meets us there and he gives her purpose. He sends her out. We see something similar with Thomas. Thomas is our next portrait. Mary brings her grief, and Jesus meets her in the midst of her grief. He doesn't wait for her to pull herself together, so to speak. Thomas, verse 24. One of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. They told him, we've seen our Lord. So what happened is Jesus came earlier. Thomas didn't happen to be there, missed out. So here's someone who kind of misses out on what other people have already experienced. They have something. They have an experience that he doesn't have. And we've probably all been through a situation where we felt like we've missed out on something. That's what Thomas is coming from when it comes to the risen, the resurrected Jesus, to Easter morning, to what Easter is all about. He replied, I'm not going to believe unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into the wound on his side. He's like, I'm not gonna believe it. And I don't know if it's so much the belief in a resurrection. We live in a very scientific world, and so I think for the idea of a resurrection, someone coming back from the dead, is something that it's hard for us to believe and wrap our minds around. I think a lot of people have a hard time with that. But I wonder with Thomas, if this is someone who's been following Jesus, this is someone who thought the kingdom would be coming in a certain way. This is someone who did not expect for him to die on a cross, probably did not expect for him to be arrested, and is probably still in shock. Mary is grieving. Thomas is probably wondering, maybe we've had an experience where we felt like God was going to come through in a certain way, and we felt like it didn't happen the way we thought. And so we doubt if God will show up again. Maybe that's the kind of doubt that Thomas is experiencing here. This is a very religious world, so I'm not sure that it's not so much scientific like ours is. So maybe he's not doubting that Jesus can be resurrected, but that Jesus will be resurrected. Maybe he's wondering if, God, I felt like Jesus sort of, there was a letdown. God didn't show up. And now, is he going to show up again? Is he going to show up in the midst of this sickness, illness? Is he going to show up in the midst of this relational breakdown that I'm experiencing? Is he going to show up in the midst of, searching for work or this vocational crisis that I'm going through? We've probably all had times where we felt like God was going to do this one thing and God didn't do it. So I'm kind of doubting that God will show up again. He replied, I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into the wound in his side. I need to touch and feel God again to believe that God is with me, or God will do it again. Well, God will show up. We've probably all experienced that sort of doubt. Think about that time where that was. 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. Peace be with you. He said, I love that word of peace, in that time of doubt where things seem unsure, where we're not sure how things are going to work out. Peace is what we want. Jesus says, peace be with you. He says to Thomas, goes right to Thomas, says, put your finger here. Look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound on my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. And Thomas' response, my Lord and my God, he exclaimed. Jesus goes on, verse 29, he says, you believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. Blessed are those. And so I think we see this as a diss on Thomas, but I don't think it's so much. This is a real incredible blessing. I think even for Thomas, even though, we're blessed if we don't see, Jesus isn't fussy with Thomas. You need to touch and feel. That's okay. I'll come to you. I will come to you in the midst of this doubt. I will show you. It's okay. You don't have to pull together the monstrous faith that you think you need to have. You don't have to pull together all this, muster up all the faith that you can. I will come to you. I am not fussy. I will show you my wounds. I'll give you something to hold on to. And so in the midst of doubt, Thomas meets Jesus. Jesus goes to Thomas, right? Resurrection means that Jesus meets us where we are at. And finally, we get to Peter. So we've seen grief, we've seen doubt, and now we're going to see this guilt and shame, which all of us have experienced as well. Peter, in chapter 21, verse 15, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, what's been happening is, Peter kind of went back to his old vocation of fishing and saw Jesus appeared out on a boat or on the shore. I'm sorry, Jesus was on the shore. Peter was on the boat and realizes it's Jesus and jumps in the water, swims to him. And Jesus has got breakfast there waiting, cooking on a fire. And Peter had denied Jesus. He had denied Jesus. He probably feels like an incredible failure as a disciple, that, the idea of just following Jesus was just a sham. Like there's no way he could do that because he seemed to have the wrong answers at every turn. And then finally, in Jesus' greatest time of need, Peter denied him 3 times. He feels like a failure. He's filled with guilt. He's filled with shame. He's filled with, I can't do this. This is not for me. This is for better people. And Jesus comes to him, has breakfast. And after breakfast, he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And here's another unfortunate English translation. We're going to see 2 different words for love here. One is love, like God's kind of love, never give up sort of love. And the other is like kind of a friendship. So I'm going to try to read it to get that nuance. It says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Peter replies, yes, Lord, you know that I like you. Feed my lambs, Jesus tells him. Feed my lambs. Gives him something to do. It's strange. He doesn't try to, you're okay, Peter, you can do it. He doesn't try to bolster him up. He gives him something to do, commissions him to do something. This is what disciples do. You do something. You go out. You share this message. Verse 16, Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know that I like you. You know that you're my friend, right? Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. Finally, a 3rd time, Jesus says, Simon, son of John, do you like me? Am I your friend? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a 3rd time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I like you. Jesus says, then feed my sheep. I love it because Peter he cannot envision himself as a true disciple because of his failures. We've all had failures. We've all had moral failures. We've all had ethical failures. We've all had spiritual failures. Peter has failed God in terms of, what he believes about himself, and that he can't do it. Whatever it means to follow Jesus, he can't do it. And Jesus, again, we find that Jesus is not fussy about where he's at. Like me? Okay, I can meet you there. Jesus says, I'll meet you there. If that's what you're going to give me, I'll meet you there. If that's all you feel like you're worth, I will meet you there. But he doesn't sit there and talk about it. He gives him something to do. And what to do is what disciples do. Feed my sheep. He commissions Peter. He doesn't even... It's not like he's going to give him a bunch of words to try to make him feel better. He gives him work to do. He's like, it's okay. If that's where you're at, I can still use you. You're still a disciple, even if you feel like you can't make it the full way. And so as we close in on these messages, I just want us, we've seen grief, we've seen doubt, we've seen shame. And the list could go on and on and on about the trials that we go through, the things that we feel like we're just not good enough. Resurrection means that Jesus meets you where you're at. It's new life, and he will come and find you. God is looking for you, even in the midst of this global pandemic, whether it's this global thing that's got the whole world disrupted right now, or whether it's some personal thing that you feel like you failed at, you feel like you're sorry over, you're grieving over, or something that it's very personal, some doubt that you have, that Jesus meets you there. He comes out of the grave and meets us where we're at. If, for those of you who are not followers of Christ, you don't consider yourself a follower of Christ, I hope that you can just take some time to think about, to consider a creator who is searching for you. Not something that you have to search for, not something that you have to uncover and discover. I think God honors those efforts if you're going out to discover, but here is a God who comes to you. And perhaps you're right on the edge. You're intrigued by Jesus, but you haven't made that step yet. It's not that you have to take that last step and get there. It's not like you have to travel the next, get over the next thing. Jesus is right here, right now, asking you to come into that relationship, to come in and bring those doubts, bring the shame, bring the grief with you. Bring the trials with you. You don't have to pull yourself together before you enter into that relationship. And I just want to challenge you to email us, email me, call me, 207-737-7075 is my phone. If that's a decision that you need to make, you want to make, you are making right now, call me up. Let me know. Text me. Email the church. Talk to someone, a friend, whoever invited you into this sermon this morning, and talk to them about that relationship and make it real. You don't have to go miles and miles to find Jesus. He is seeking you out and will meet you right where you're at and right in the midst of your suffering. If you're a Christian, you know that being a Christian doesn't mean that you're perfect, that we struggle. And when we go through those struggles, we tend to beat ourselves up. And the miracle, the message of resurrection that we need to hear week in and week out, year in and year out, is that Jesus meets us. For some reason, we get this crazy idea that we got to pull ourselves together and do all the work ourselves. Not true. Not true. Jesus is coming out of that grave, out of that place of death, to meet you where you are at. And to, we don't have to be superstars to be disciples. Okay, so your homework. If you're going to work through the liturgy that we gave you this morning, or if you're going to talk with groups, whatever, the homework is which character do you most identify with? Mary, Thomas, or Peter? Why is that? Who do you know in all those scenarios? Who do you identify with the most? And and you know, I guess that's it. You know, who do you identify with, and and why? Why is that? Maybe it's a time of confession, just sharing with one another. Here's where I'm at, and here's why I feel like Mary, I feel like Thomas, I feel like Peter. Why is that? Discuss that amongst yourselves, and we'll see you next week. We're gonna dive into this passage a little bit more. We got some great stuff to look at as we continue this series. Resurrection means fill in the blank. Resurrection means that Jesus meets us where we're at. I hope you find that to be true on this Easter. God bless. We'll see you next week.